amb nosaltres Irina Ulasiuk. Jo aquí, quan l'he saludat, he comès també un error, i és que jo em pensava que ella era d'Ucraïna, ella és de Bielorússia, perquè jo la coneixia com a estudiosa d'Ucraïna, i de fet, així com amb la Sevna ja ens havíem conegut alguna altra ocasió, hem coincidit, amb la Irina no havíem coincidit, la coneixíem a través d'un professor que sí que coneixem justament, que és un amic comú nostre, el professor Bruno de Witte, qui li va dirigir justament amb ella una tesi doctoral sobre temes vinculats a drets fonamentals i drets lingüístics, i en aquest cas també els drets lingüístics a Ucraïna. Justament arran d'això vam tenir coneixement de la seva tesi doctoral i com a coneixedora de la situació legal d'una llengua que també entraria dintre d'aquestes comunitats lingüístiques mitjanes i per nosaltres poc coneguda, com seria aquesta comunitat de parla ucraïnesa, ens ha semblat que era oportú convidar-la. De fet, ella és professora associada a l'Institut Universitari Europeu de Florència, un prestigiós centre europeu, i bé, doncs li donem la benvinguda, li agraïm que hagi acceptat la invitació. Només també dir que justament li havíem demanat anteriorment un treball en què ens expliqués la situació legal de les llengües a Ucraïna per la revista Llengua i Dret, i que justament aquest treball es publica en el número a punt d'aparèixer de la revista Llengua i Dret, que sortirà ara a finals de novembre, primers de desembre, i per tant també a partir d'aquest treball podem conèixer més les opinions de la professora Irina Ulasiuk, a qui li dono la paraula. Moltes gràcies.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank everybody for having invited me to this conference, and I will be happy to share with you some of the findings of my research project, doctoral project, which I conducted at the European University Institute, and which had a general title of Europeanization of Language Rights in Russia and Ukraine. It was a comparative research project which looked at the implementation of European standards with regard to language rights in Russia and Ukraine. So in today's presentation, I will try to investigate the place the Ukrainian legislation reserves for the language rights of the titular language of the Ukrainian state, that is, for the Ukrainian language. First, the history of the position of the Ukrainian language in Ukraine will be discussed, but quite briefly, and I think it's necessary as the background for the better understanding of present-day policies and law. The analysis of the legal aspects of the current language policy and law in Ukraine will follow, and beyond this, an attempt will be made to identify different scenarios of the future development of language legislation concerning the position of the Ukrainian language. Now, a few words about the past practices. First of all, we should keep in mind that unlike many European states, Ukraine does not have a stable and developed historical tradition of independent statehood. Until now, Ukraine only enjoyed two brief periods of independence. It was in the 17th century and under a succession of weak governments between 1917 and 1921. Interestingly, these two historical events are now being very much glorified by the Ukrainian elite and are sometimes viewed as the most prominent themes of the national past of Ukraine. The result is that Ukraine has a less clearly defined national identity than some of its neighbors. With regard to languages, as this can suggest, there has been a long history of official but non-Ukrainian languages, including Polish, Russian, German, and Romanian, which were administratively imposed by the governing regimes. In 1922, most part of Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union as one of the Soviet republics. But despite the fact that the Ukrainians were the official titular nation and the prevailing ethnic majority in the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, they were just subjected to what was called internationalist policies, the ultimate goal of which was the merger, or in Russian it was sliyanie, of different ethnic groups into a new historical community of Soviet people. Nationality policies therefore did not promote a Ukrainian identity, but they rather promoted a Little Russian regional and geographical identity. The result was that at the beginning of the 90s there existed a real threat to the very existence of the language of the titular of the majority nation. While Ukrainian was by no means illegitimate, it was marginalized and rarely used, especially in central and eastern parts of the country. Russian was imposed forcefully, but it also attracted people by the privileges which were associated with it, so access to good education and decent jobs. And while at an individual level, Ukrainian was perceived as a natural native language of ethnic Ukrainians, when Ukraine became independent, so basically in most cities in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, there were almost no schools with instruction in Ukraine. The language of the titular nation was rarely used in the street and almost never in the government and public bodies. Many other ethnocultural demands of the Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians were not better met. Very few institutions of higher education actually continued to teach in Ukrainian, with the exception of some institutions in western regions. Almost no movies were shown in Ukrainian, not even among those that were produced in Ukraine. That is why, as most authors agree, since Ukraine gained its independence, it has engaged itself into a linguistically oriented nation-building project and has consistently pursued a policy of promoting a new national identity based on the titular language and culture. Just to give you some idea of the present-day ethnic and linguistic composition of Ukraine. So there was the last census, all-nation census, was conducted in 2001, and it gave the following results. Ukraine's population now includes 37.5 million Ukrainians, and they are the national majority. They make up 77.8% of the total population of the country. There are also 10.9 million members of other nationalities, and that is 22.2%. Russians are the second most numerous ethnic group in Ukraine and also its largest minority. They constitute 8.3 million people, or 17.3%. 8 other most numerous national minorities include Belarusians, Moldovans, Crimean Tatars, Romanians, Poles, and Jews. It should be mentioned that Ukraine's multiculturalism is pronouncedly regional in nature. It can be historically explained. Before the First World War, Ukraine was partitioned between Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire. And central and eastern Ukraine, as you can imagine, belonged to the Imperial Russia, while the western part belonged to the more liberal Austrian Hungarian Empire. Thus, central and northern western Ukraine have historically been the basic regions of ethnic Ukrainian settlement. Most ethnic Russians reside in the eastern regions of Ukraine. The linguistic composition of Ukrainian state is as follows in accordance with the 2001 census. The proportion of those whose mother tongue is Ukrainian totals 67.5% of the population. Those whose mother tongue is Russian account for 29.6% of the population. The proportion of other languages specified as mother tongue accounts for 2.9%. The situation is very often complicated by a discrepancy between ethnicity and declared mother tongue. What is more, there seems to exist even a wider gap between declared mother tongue and actual language use. And this actually points to a central feature of Ukraine, which is comparatively unusual, I think. Due to the historical development, Russian happens to be mother tongue or a language of common use for many people who identify themselves in ethnic terms as Ukrainians. As a matter of fact, many researchers propose a threefold division of the Ukrainian population. Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, that is 40%, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, 33-34%, and Russian-speaking Russians, 21%. Another peculiarity relevant to the linguistic situation in Ukraine is that while language use is currently split approximately evenly between Ukrainian and Russian in Ukraine, the language differences have actually two dimensions: a regional division between Western and Eastern Ukraine, and a social division between the urban and rural population. Ukrainian and Russian are spoken in approximately equal amounts across Ukraine as a whole, with a greater concentration of Russian speakers, those who speak Russian in their daily life, in the east, south, and in the metropolitan areas, while there are more Ukrainian speakers in central and western areas, and in general across most of Ukraine's rural areas. Now let us turn to the present-day practices and law with regard to the Ukrainian language. Since independence, the language policy pursued by the Ukrainian state may be summarized in the following way. Ukrainian was to replace Russian as a language everybody would understand and use both in public and hopefully in private. The position of the Ukrainian language would be legalized by granting it the status of the sole state language of Ukraine. As for the non-Russian national minorities whose national revival was also called for since independence, their languages could be used in areas of compact residence. Meanwhile, the Russians would become a minority like any other. So, to sum up, I would say that in the 20th century, Ukraine had to go through two periods of radical change. First, adaptation to Russian dominance, and second, withdrawal from it. Let us now address the most important legal developments since 1989 and see the place that they envisaged for the Ukrainian language. To make the talk more informative, I will be giving you examples from three areas of language use: education, use of languages before public authorities, and the media, the three areas which are commonly viewed as the most important for the survival of a language, especially in a vulnerable situation. In October 1989, the Ukrainian parliament enacted the law on languages. The law officially established the Ukrainian language as the sole state language and proclaimed the transition from the Ukrainian language use in governmental, educational, and commercial domains to the Ukrainian language use within these public spheres. The law was a sort of a defensive reaction of the communist old guard, which could no longer justify the status quo. And on the other hand, I think it was a very important instrument for later governments to base their language policies on. It basically marked the onset of a cultural and linguistic nation-building project that sought to redress Russification and to reaffirm Ukrainian distinctiveness vis-à-vis Russian. Thus, the laws provided for extensive use of Ukrainian and became one of the first legal steps towards de-Sovietization and independence of the country in 1991. It also tried to reverse a long-established relationship between Ukrainian as a low peasant language and Russian as the high cultured language. It is interesting to know that the drafting of the law on languages was in the focus of public attention from the very start. And before the final version was adopted, 4 different drafts were suggested. 3 of them aimed at radical Ukrainization, 1 of them at preserving the status quo. And interestingly, it received nearly 24,000 comments and observations in the public debates which surrounded it. Quite interestingly, since the law actually was adopted several years after, so new discussions have started, and no less intense discussions are being surrounding the issue of the language now. Also, no less intense discussions surrounded the language issue in the adoption of the Constitution several years after the law on languages was adopted in 1996. Here again, the determination to have Ukrainian as the sole state language prevailed and was confirmed. I will now address very briefly some of the provisions of the Constitution, and will then get back to the law on languages, and we will have a chance to see in a chronological order how actually the position of the Ukrainian language in Ukrainian legislation was established. Article 10 of the Constitution states, "The state language of Ukraine is the Ukrainian language. The state ensures the comprehensive development and functioning of the Ukrainian language in all spheres of social life throughout the entire territory of Ukraine." However, the law also says, the Constitution also says, in Ukraine, the free development, use, and protection of Russian and other languages of national minorities of Ukraine is guaranteed. The exact meaning of Article 10 was interpreted in 1999 decision of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. This decision concerned the use of the state language by bodies of state power, bodies of local self-government, and its application in the teaching process in educational institutions of Ukraine. The official interpretation was given upon the request of some parliamentarians of Ukraine on the supposed grounds that in certain public authorities, institutions, and also in state educational institutions, the state language was being ignored. The central issue was the extent to which Article 10 could be applied in an effort to protect the state language without diminishing the role of other languages. The court said that Ukrainian should be used in most official languages, in most official contexts, including as a working language of public authorities, bodies of legislative, executive, and judicial power, as a working language of public authorities of the Autonomous Republic of the Crimea, and as a working language of local self-government. Let me just specify one thing. So the court said that it should be used as a working language of public authorities of the Autonomous Republic of the Crimea, and the Crimea is the only region in the Ukraine where actually Ukrainians are a minority and the Russians are a majority. The court also said that the Ukrainian language is the language of acts, work, office, clerical work, documentation, and it is to be used also in all other public spheres of social life. That is, it is designated as the official language of communication with citizens of Ukraine on behalf of the Ukrainian state. It is the language of armed forces of Ukraine. The Ukrainian-only mandate extends to publications of materials of internal office use of state bodies and materials for public use distributed through state bodies, institutions, or organizations. The distribution of information on the performance of state authorities and local self-governments bodies by mass media, and many other areas. In 2008, the same question arose, and the Constitutional Court of Ukraine again had to address the issue of the use of the state language. But this time, the question arose in connection with the use of languages in courts, namely civil and administrative courts. The conclusion the court drew could be summarized as followed. Courts use the state language in the process of court proceedings. However, they guarantee citizens a right to use their native language during the court process or a language they speak as provided for in the Constitution and laws of Ukraine. Despite the interpretative nature of the decisions, especially the 1999 decision provoked a diplomatic war between Russia and Ukraine, each accusing the other of violating the linguistic rights of its Russian and Ukrainian minorities respectively. The status of Ukrainians in Russia and Russians in Ukraine was actually a subject of a visit of a High Commissioner for National Minorities, and I think mostly and thanks to his intervention, the conflict was resolved peacefully. Getting back to 1999, when the law on languages was adopted, it should be mentioned that nobody expected quick results. And for many, it was more a symbolic nomination of the Ukrainian language as the state language, and rather than something that will practically be implemented very quickly. That is why probably, if we recall, even Russian speakers and the Russian population did not consider it as a potential threat to the Russian language use. And that's why when the referendum on the question of the Ukrainian independence was conducted, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they all voted for, because nobody thought that the nomination of the Ukrainian language as the state language would somehow alter the status quo. However, a 10-year plan for the gradual transition to Ukrainian was adopted, and a special commission was organized to elaborate a program on the functioning of the Ukrainian language. In the meantime, the authorities were to create appropriate conditions to guarantee the effective learning of the state language through the network of educational institutions and by way of organizing courses for adults at enterprises offices. Within 10 years, language used in the educational sphere was to transfer from Russian to Ukrainian. And within 5 years, Ukrainian was supposed to become a primary language in dealings with public authorities. Several steps were taken in order to further promote the state language, especially in the educational sphere. As early as 1987, there were demands that the Ukrainian authorities should introduce the obligatory teaching of the Ukrainian language and literature in all schools of the Republic, regardless of the language of instruction. In the autumn of 1992, the Ministry of Education instructed local school authorities that the proportion of first graders enrolled in schools should correspond to the proportion of first graders enrolled in Russian schools should correspond to the proportion of ethnic Russians within that district. That is, the number of schools teaching in Ukrainian and Russian should be correlated with the respective sizes of these ethnic, not linguistic groups. In order to achieve the goal, which basically meant to radically change the linguistic profile of education, which comprised more than half of the Russian language schools, the right of parents to choose their language the language of instruction for their children, granted in 1959 under the Soviet system, was to be basically withdrawn. It was believed that this right was a way of Russification, and it was at that time, due to the social dominance and higher prestige of Russian. Thus, with each new class of first graders, only Ukrainian language classes were offered in all schools except Russian schools. Second, the same year, the ministry announced that schools with Ukrainian as the primary language of instruction may choose whether they would offer or not Russian language study. Third, Ukrainian language and literature were made mandatory subjects in minority language medium schools. putting an end to a widespread Soviet practice of exempting children, for example, in Russian schools from attending Ukrainian language classes. The Ukrainian government also launched a program of publishing new textbooks in Ukrainian. Finally, the majority of teachers would be retrained to teach with Ukrainian as the language of instruction. And in the years to follow, the status of the state language was addressed in a number of documents. Just some names that I think are quite telling. The state program of ensuring the functioning and developing of the Ukrainian language in 2004-2010. The order of the Ministry of Education and Science on the creation of appropriate conditions for ensuring the effectiveness of studying of the Ukrainian language in general education institutions with national minority languages as the languages of instruction. Basically, all these, and there are many other documents that they were issued, all of them had their final goal to promote the Ukrainian language in education.